stretching across the walls like it had nowhere to be. The apartment was unusually silent, save for the low murmur of the refrigerator and the faint creaks from the old wooden floor beneath my bare feet. There was no urgency, no obligation. Just an unmarked space and time waiting to be filled. I was still halfway between dreams and reality when I noticed the missed call from Ethan.
No voy se me.
Just a quick text that followed. Hey, I left my watch at your place. Mind dropping it off. Simple.
Ordinary.
The watch sat on the kitchen counter where he'd left it the night before after a night of beer, lazy laughs, and video games. Just two friends killing time. Ethan's house wasn't far across town, a route I could drive in my sleep. I knew the path well, the rust-stained mailbox, the jasmine vines that clung stubbornly to the fence. Always composed in a way that made him seem distant but not cold. We exchanged nods. Greetings. That was the extent of it. So I was expecting Ethan when the door opened, but it was me.
Carter.
He looked surprised, but not unpleasantly so. He wore a faded blue t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. A coffee mug rested comfortably in his hand, steam curling up like a quiet thought. Said something about a run to the hardware store. I held up the watch, feeling suddenly self-conscious. Just returning this. His eyes crinkled slightly. Come in for a bit. Coffee? There was a calmness in him that I hadn't noticed before, like a quiet room after a storm. Inside, the house felt different. Quieter, yes, but also fuller somehow. The scent of toasted bread lingered in the air, blending with the faint musk of old paper. We sat in the living room, light spilling in through gauzy curtains. His eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the window, how life expands and contracts. One moment the house is a storm of voices and footsteps, and then it's just the ticking of clocks. There was a brief flicker when our eyes met and held. Neither of us looked away. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music swell, no sudden revelation. Just something real. A recognition, perhaps, of shared solitude. I didn't know then what that moment would mean, but it stayed with me like a soft echo I couldn't unhear. That morning had begun with silence, but by the time I left, something had shifted quietly, deeply, like the first ripple on still water. A week had gone by quietly, almost stealthily. The kind of time that tiptoes past you when you're not looking. On the surface, life resumed its routines, its neatly folded habits. But beneath, something had unsettled. I caught myself thinking of him. Not obsessively, not even consciously sometimes. Just wondering, like a gentle tide brushing the shore, never loud, but always returning. It happened by chance, or maybe fate trying not to be obvious. We crossed paths in the grocery store. He stood in aisle 5, examining the back of a pasta sauce jar with the kind of concentration people usually reserve for instructions on defusing bombs. His brow was furrowed, lips moving slightly as if tasting the ingredients on the label. Then he looked up and something softened. Not just in his face, but in the air around us. Ryan, he said. Just my name. Nothing else. But somehow, it carried the weight of a question, a memory, and a hope. We talked lightly, as if afraid to disturb the fragile thread that had stitched itself between us again. Then he asked, a little shyly, if I was free that evening.
Ethan would be out late, he said.
He thought he might cook. His voice didn't suggest anything, yet hinted at everything. I said yes, instantly, almost before he'd finished the sentence. When I arrived at his house, it felt different, as if time moved slower there, as if the walls had inhaled something sacred. He was humming a low, tuneless sound and stirring something on the stove. His apron was dusted with flour, like a story half told. He handed me a glass of wine, our fingers brushing for a second too long. And suddenly, we weren't strangers rediscovering each other. We were something more unfinished, more intimate. Dinner was humble pasta, garlic bread, salad, but somehow it tasted like nostalgia. Like a memory we hadn't made yet. We moved around each other in the kitchen like dancers learning steps they'd once known by heart. He asked questions that made me feel seen, really seen. And when I answered, he listened with his eyes. There was a warmth in the silence between us, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. After we ate, we drifted to the couch. We didn't touch. Not exactly. But the air between us vibrated with an invisible closeness. I could feel his warmth, his breath, the hesitation in his posture, like he was leaning toward a decision. Then, quietly, like a truth slipping out of the dark, he turned to me. "Ryan," he said, his voice lower now, more vulnerable, "do you ever feel like you're living beside your own life instead of in it?" I looked at him, and I knew. I knew what he meant, not just the words, but the weight behind them. "Yeah," I said, after a long pause. "More often than I want to admit." He didn't smile to fill the silence. He smiled because he recognized the shape of my answer, and it mirrored his own. "I didn't expect to say that out loud," he whispered. A few seconds passed. Then he added, as if confessing something more sacred than any secret, "I'm glad you came tonight." And in that moment, gentle, unspoken, unceremonious, something shifted. Not in the room, not in the conversation, but in us. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly, like the slow onset of a storm you don't realize is coming until the wind's already shifting around you. He began visiting more often. Not because we planned it, not because we needed to. He simply showed up always when Ethan wasn't home, as if by instinct or unspoken agreement. Sometimes, we would talk, really talk, about the things that matter, but never get said. Regrets that still echoed in quiet corners of the mind. Choices not taken. The strange peace of early mornings when the world is still asleep and you're left alone with the weight of your own thoughts. Other times, we didn't say much at all. We'd just sit on the couch, sharing the same space, letting an old black and white film flicker across the screen. The tea between us would grow cold while we remained lost in the kind of silence that felt more like understanding than absence. It was there in that stillness that something began to grow. It wasn't the kind of love you shout across rooftops or write songs about. It was quieter, steadier. It lived in the spaces between gestures. A brush of fingers as we reached for the same spoon. A glance that lingered too long but never asked to be explained. It lived in the way I began to notice his laugh, not just hear it. How it wrapped around the room like warmth. How his eyes darted when he was thinking, revealing a mind always 2 steps ahead. One night, just as I was about to leave, he stopped me. He didn't touch me. He didn't have to. His voice alone carried the tremble of something sacred. "Ryan," he said, soft and raw, like he'd been holding it in for years. "I don't know what this is, but it's something." I looked at him really, and at that moment, the labels didn't matter. The boundaries, the definitions, the should we or could we, they all fell away. "I know," I whispered back. That was all. We never gave it a name. We never set rules or made promises. But what we shared kept growing, quietly taking root in every look, every silence. Every night spent not needing to explain a single thing. And somehow that was enough. Time passed not in grand flourishes or loud declarations, but in the soft ticking of quiet days. A year, maybe more. The world outside spun with its noise, its chaos, its blind certainty. But in the quiet crevices of it all, we carved out something hushed, something sacred. Ethan never knew. I suppose that was part of the plan. We were careful intentionally. Every encounter was a calculated breath, every meeting a whispered moment suspended in time. We weren't reckless. We were reverent. And in that reverence, we found something startlingly beautiful. Ours was a story written between the lines, never spoken aloud, never given the dignity of public acknowledgement. But it lived. It breathed.
And it mattered.
Sometimes, in the loneliest corners of night, I loathed myself. The guilt of secrecy wrapped itself around my chest like a tightening cord. Not because I thought what we had was wrong, but because I couldn't share it. I couldn't show the world how soft he made me feel, how seen I was in his eyes. And yet, through all that shame, there was never a single moment I doubted us. What we had was more realer than anything dressed up in daylight ever felt. We exchanged pieces of ourselves like folded paper notes. Books passed between palms, songs hummed under breath, meals that stretched into wordless companionship. We talked quietly. Of dreams. Of fears. Of what it meant to be understood without translation. Sometimes, when the weight of it all became too much, we cried. Other times, we just sat his shoulder brushing mine, our hearts humming the same silent song. The world outside was always loud. But inside those tiny spaces we claimed living rooms lit by lamplight, park benches under heavy skies, we found an impossible stillness. Something that felt, for a flickering moment, like peace. I remember the rain. We were inside, the window fogged, the air thick with the scent of early autumn. He looked at me, that quiet look he gave when words felt too clumsy. And then he asked, barely louder than the patter of the drops, "Do you think we'll ever stop hiding?" I couldn't answer. I didn't have the courage to lie, nor the faith to promise. I just looked back at him, holding everything I felt behind a soft smile. Because in that room, at that moment, we weren't hiding. We were just being. Together. Fully. Maybe for once, that was enough. Even now, when I wander past the places we used to haunt, the old bookstore, the little cafe tucked beneath ivy, that narrow street with the orange light, I feel it. That ghost of a connection. Gentle, fleeting, but persistent. Like perfume on an old scarf or the aftertaste of a melody you once loved. Ours wasn't a love that asked to be seen. It didn't clamor for definition. It didn't fight for permanence. It simply existed in glances, in pauses, in the silences that never felt empty. And maybe that's the truest kind of love. The kind that doesn't need recognition to be real.